Joining us in the studio is Dr. Max Kigobe, a senior lecturer at Makerere University who is well versed in water resource modeling and climate change modeling for the Upper Nile Basin. He is also into hydraulic modeling for most of our challenging water flow structures in Uganda. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Max.
You're welcome.
When you say water resource modeling, what does that mean?
It implies trying to reproduce our water resources in Uganda, and that could imply a lot of issues. How much water do we have, which is coming up, how much water is flowing over the surfaces, and how much water even goes into the ground as groundwater flow. So it can also include hydraulics when it comes to waters all over the surfaces and all these floods we have in Uganda. So it's quite a widespread area of modeling.
Climate change modeling.
Yes.
What does that mean?
For climate change modeling, you're looking at how intense our rainfall patterns can be, or how diverse they can be, also how limited they can be for Uganda. And Uganda being a tropical country with tropical climate, with two climatic zones, it can be quite very expensive, rather quite very, very intense and very disturbing in terms of modeling it. So it can be quite complex in terms of reproducing the patterns. You must reproduce the past climate for over 30 years when the climate was stable. Then think about the future when things like pressure, temperature, relative humidity are changing in the future. What will happen when it comes to 2020s, 2060s, and 2080s?
So, for our listeners, if you're able to go to Google Scholar and you Google Max Kigobe, the amount of research that is on here, I'm just looking at all of these, are they called articles? Are they called papers? Articles that you've written. So future hydrology and climate in the River Nile Basin, evaluation of 5 satellite products for estimation of rainfall over Uganda. This is a lot of research into our rainfall patterns.
Yes, please.
What do these patterns look like?
The patterns are getting very, very enormous. They're increasing. And when they increase, it doesn't mean that every month you're going to have very intense rainfall, but the times of rainfall, the 2 rainfall seasons, it may be very, very high in terms of intensity. And that can bother ourselves so much because you're trying to have very intense rainfall which you can't, or you haven't planned for in terms of drainage patterns for our urban areas, or even drainage patterns in terms of our local areas, and also a lot of rainfall on the ground, over the ground, for our forested areas or our vegetated areas. And we must plan and think about it. How can you get this well captured? How can you get this well utilized if you can actually make touch of that water and use it perfectly well?
When you do this research, how many years are you looking at to help you get a feel of either things are going to change for the worse or this is how much they're changing? When did you do this research and what are you seeing that's giving you an indicator that this is where we're going?
When you do this research, it can be quite complex. You must reproduce the past climate. So I did reproduce the past climate from 1960 to 1990 when the climate was stable. But right now, we have over 17 general climate change models, which you have to look at in terms of downscaling. And by downscaling, you're trying to narrow down the reproductions or the estimates they have made for the future. How can you tell that you have the right estimates of these climate situations in the future to come? And they look at 2020s, 2060s, and 2080s. So the question can be, what is the best climate change model you can rely on to reproduce what you're going to project? And that can be very thorough research work. Because to do that, you must use those models to be sure that you have the right estimates of your projections. So you must think about that very, very greatly in terms of predicting. And that comes from reproducing the past climate that we had when it was stable. That's 1960 to 1990s.
How did you get into this line of work?
When I was doing my master's study in Belgium, I used to see a lot of talk about climate change. And by then, we had thorough teaching about issues that may happen with our water resources, especially in developing countries. But by then, there was no research about climate change in Uganda. There was limited research about climate change in Africa. So when I went for my additional studies at Imperial College London, my PhD had to involve climate change and land use change on our weather patterns here in Uganda. And I would say by that time it was a very serious issue to think about in terms of modeling climate change for the whole of the world.
When you were doing your research, your initial research, and you're thinking about back home now, you're thinking about Uganda and how this relates here, what shocked you and what still shocks you?
I would say what shocked me was the way we manage our water resources. As you can see, we have a lot of talk about our water resource issues in Uganda. Even on the radios, you can hear about Kampala being the capital city of floods and all that. So it's a very challenging issue, and I would say we have to think deeply about our water resource management. And even to do this, we must have that integration between the people into managing of the urban areas, also the researchers at the university. So it can be a very challenging issue to actually integrate each other, because who understands it very well? And how do you make the other person who doesn't understand it very well to pick the interest to support that kind of understanding? So it is challenging in that aspect. At the same time, most of the research funders, they are also supporting a lot of research in climate change for the whole of the world. So I would say, if you try to read around and see the research interests of GIZ or GTZ or DAD or British High Commission, they are into the support of this concept of modeling climate change for the whole world.
Tell me about some of the research that you've done most recently that's specific to Uganda.
Okay, for Uganda, I've tried to reproduce our past rainfall. That's from 1960 to 1990. That is 30 years of rainfall patterns for the whole of Uganda. I've reproduced the rainfall for the whole of Uganda, for all the rainfall stations. And I would say that if you try to look at my publications, you can see that I can tell how much the monthly totals were, the monthly averages were, and the monthly standard deviations were for those past years when the climate was stable. So if you can do that, then you can think about the additional work of predicting climate change for the future.
You said when the climate was stable.
Yes.
And that then means that it is not stable.
Right now it is not.
So what is the indicator that it is not stable?
The indicator can look at the amount of rainfalls you try to get for every monthly patterns. So if right now, at the right time now, 2020s.
So let's look at our current rainfall patterns for
Yes.
this month of November.
Exactly.
What are they telling us?
They are not as standard as they used to be in the 1960s. They are different.
What's different? What was standard in the 1960s?
Well, if you look at the values, we're having a lot of more rainfall right now compared to the 1960s to 1990s. And that's not something very manageable. And again, you have to look at the entire country. That could be rainfall for the whole of Kampala, which is a good rainfall zone for Kampala Mukono. But again, if you go to Arua, Kotido, Gulu, they may have again very dry moments for these times when it shouldn't be that dry. So even when you think about it, you might think about the wet areas and the dry areas as well. So it can be that challenging in terms of the standard rainfall zones we have for the whole of Uganda.
And when we say more rainfall, are we speaking in terms of intensity, or are we speaking in terms of every day it's raining?
We are thinking of both the intensity and also the totals you have on monthly averages. For example, yesterday it rained so much, and you could say, how come we're having all this rainfall the entire day? But if you think about the whole month again, ask yourself, how much will the rainfall be for this whole month? Is it going to be the standard rainfall we used to have in the 1960s, 1990s, or has it changed? And the fact is that it actually changed.
Are we factoring? Do you see us factoring in these changes, this now heavier and more frequent rainfall, in our planning for our infrastructure?
We need to factor that in. And that's a very, very serious observation you're trying to ask. But the question is, if someone is designing infrastructure, who is the person concerned? Is the person sponsoring that factoring in and having the right kind of drainage patterns, or the drainage infrastructure, or the infrastructure which can cater for additional rainfall overflows on the surfaces?
Give me an example.
An example could be the whole of Kampala. We have a lot of rainfall coming up. We have a lot of buildings coming up. But ask yourself, do you have the right drainage for the entire of Kampala? Maybe not. If you get out of the urban areas, it can be different because they have good vegetation. So when you look at vegetation as well, and vegetation comes in terms of land use. So if the land use also changes, it can be a very challenging issue. Because by land use change, you can think about urban growth. You have cities coming up, but have you planned smartly for the drainage of those cities coming up? Have you planned smartly for the buildings which are being built up in these smaller countries which are getting much, smaller towns which are getting much better and much bigger with our growth in economy? So it's a very, very challenging issue.
You said you are into hydraulic modeling for most of our challenging water flow structures.
Yes.
What does that mean and look like?
By hydraulics, you're looking at the flows of water. If it rains, how does water flow over the surfaces? It may go into a drainage channel, but is the channel built to contain all the capacity which is flowing in? The channel may have been built based on return periods, as it's always done. If you want a smaller channel, you have a small return period for that design of that channel. If you want a bigger channel, you have a higher return period of that channel. But again, the bigger it gets, the more expensive it can be, and then it can be disturbing for the funder, or even for the constructor, to get into that. A good example can be Northern Bypass. I designed the drainage capacity of Northern Bypass around 20 years back. But the whole of Northern Bypass doesn't flood. And because we use the right kind of estimation of a higher return period, it was expensive to build the road, but as you see, you have better results.
Give me paint a picture for me. So you're sitting with a team. Who is part of this team that's then making the decision and understanding why certain decisions have to be made the way they're made to end up with a Northern Bypass that's now not flooding? Mm-hmm. And the reason I'm asking this is because I want to then understand why other places that also had a team are not doing as well as the bypass.
Well, when I was involved with that Northern Bypass, I was still a junior. I was still trying to find my levels of interest in terms of expanding my capacity, intellectual capacity. And I felt so disturbed when you'd see everyone kind of getting so disturbed when you're trying to look at where northern bypass is going to pass. Because you'd walk through the valleys and see where the bypass is going to pass. But right now, we have the issue of integration. Can we try to be integrated in all our designs, in all our research? The ministry needs to cooperate a lot with the university, and I'm talking about the Ministry of Water and Environment. At the same time, even the NGOs need to cooperate with the ministries and also with the university. And I would say, if there's even room for capacity in terms of the juniors, if you train the juniors to enhance their ability to work and think smart for the future, the better for us all. So it's a very, very challenging issue. And I would say, if we can think together as in integrated thinking, integrated planning, integrated management of water resources, the better for all of us in the country.
Who needs to be on the table for a good road network, for example, or a good bridge, or whatever infrastructure you decide? Who needs to be on that table? So you have engineers, you have the ministries. Who else?
I would say it's a challenging question, but I would say all of us need to be on the table. Because most times when you're designing, even a social scientist needs to come in and think about whom are you designing for? How many are they? An engineer won't tell you how many people are going to be in that area. So we need to have that kind of integrated planning.
So someone has to come and say, right now the population in this area is this, but in the next 10, 20 years, this is what we might be looking at. So we have to plan for this number of people.
That's the point. So if you can think about that, we need to have that very wide integrated planning, especially from the top. Because the top have the connections, the top people have the funders, the top people have all the links to those who can support us. So if you can try also to grade down to that spirit and think about the locals, how can we get the locals also involved? And by the locals, I even involve the universities in terms of the university research students. Many of the students are interested in learning, but they don't have support in terms of buying data, buying models, buying computers, and yet you have a lot of available capacity to build their passing on of this knowledge and their building on of this knowledge. So you need to have that very wide range integrated planning and thinking. If the ministries can also involve universities in terms of their planning, it will be a very useful and helpful way to life ahead.
I mean, why not make use of this resource that's available in their planning? It sounds like common sense.
Well, it's a challenge, but most times we wouldn't get to know what's being planned. We only get to know when things are ready, commercialized and things are already officiated. And that's the challenge we have, which is a very big challenge. But I would say if you can integrate also the academic society into the planning, it would help a lot.
When you're going around Kampala today,
Yes.
when you are reading newspapers or watching the news on TV, and you're seeing these visuals. So the other day there was this visual of the car that was stuck in the water.
Sure.
That was swimming, and then there were rescue efforts for the people that were in there. What are you thinking?
It's a challenge because I would say Kampala is growing greatly. We have a lot of buildings coming up, and we need this as well. But the issue also can be, if you've built up infrastructure, have you planned drainage for that infrastructure? If you've put up this infrastructure, have you planned drainage for this infrastructure? And if it's being planned, where is it being taken to? Is it all going to Makshon Bay, for the whole of Kampala? Is Marshman Bay still functional enough to associate with the growth of the city? These are very, very great questions.
Think about Pakwach
Yes.
and the floods there recently. We saw that as well.
Yep.
What are you thinking?
Now, Pakwach, again, it's in a very dry rainfall zone. And because of that, it doesn't stop it from being affected by our climate change. So if it's a dry area, limited vegetation, if climate change comes in, the water will come and have a very destructive pattern over the surfaces because of the vegetation. And you can't blame any administration in Pakwach, but it's the kind of climate patterns we have in Pakwach. It's a very dry area, and I would say, because it's a dry area, we have to think for them as well. How can we plan for them to have the right channels also, in case we have these patterns of climate coming in, which have changed from the past when things were stable. And population growth is another issue, because you are having a lot of infrastructure coming up, even away from the urban centers. But as we planned for the drainage of those infrastructure which are coming up, especially for the residential areas?